It was the long sleeves in summer that I noticed first. A little girl, 7 years old in the warmest week of the year, and she was wearing long sleeves, buttoned at the wrist, every single day. Nobody else saw it, or nobody else let themselves see it. But I saw it, and once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it, and it led me to the most important thing I ever did in that uniform. I've waited a long time to tell this story. I've changed every name and every place because the heart of it is a child, and a child's protection comes before any tale. So I'll tell you it happens in a small invented kingdom, call it Aldenmore, a place you won't find on any map, an old proud little country with an old proud little palace. None of the people are real. But the truth of it is real, the kind of truth that's true in 100 quiet places that have nothing to do with palaces at all. Because the thing this story is really about, a child being hurt, and an adult finally noticing, happens far more often than any of us wants to believe, and it almost always turns on the same thing. Whether one person is paying close enough attention to see what everyone else is missing. Let me tell you how I came to see it. My name is Anders. For a good many years I served in the household guard of the royal family of Aldenmore. Not the glamorous side, the ordinary, everyday side, the guard who stands in the corridors and at the doors of a working palace, who becomes part of the furniture, who sees the whole life of the place flow past day after day. And the thing about being furniture, the thing I've said before and will say again because it's the truest thing I know about that job, is that people stop noticing you. And when people stop noticing you, you get to notice them. All of them. The whole human truth of a place, playing out in front of a man everyone has forgotten is watching. The little girl in this story is Princess Elise, the youngest child of the royal house, 7 years old that summer. And I want to tell you about her the way I knew her because it matters. She was a quiet child. Not shy exactly, quiet in a different way, a watchful way, the way a child is quiet when they've learned that the world is not always safe, and that the wisest thing to do is to stay small and still and not draw attention. I didn't understand that about her at first. I just thought she was a serious, gentle little thing. It was only later that I understood her quietness was a kind of survival, that she'd learned to make herself unnoticeable, the way a small animal does when there are larger animals about. She used to pass my post on her way through the palace, and at first she barely looked at me, the way children of that house mostly didn't look at the guards. But over time, slowly, the way you earn the trust of a watchful creature, she began to give me a small look as she passed, then a tiny smile. Then, eventually, a quiet hello in her small voice. It took months. You don't earn that kind of trust from that kind of child quickly. But I earned it a little at a time by being exactly what a guard is. Steady, constant, unmoving, always there, never demanding anything. To a child who'd learned the world was unpredictable, I think the most precious thing about me was that I was predictable. I was always there. I never changed. I was safe in the way that fixed, unchanging things are safe. I didn't know yet how much that was going to matter. It was high summer when I first noticed the sleeves. A real heat wave Aldenmore doesn't get many, but that year the whole country baked, the stone of the old palace holding the heat so that even the cool corridors went warm and close, everyone in the lightest clothes they could manage, the windows thrown open to catch any breath of air. The kind of weather where children run about in as little as they can get away with, where keeping them in anything more than the bare minimum is a battle. And Princess Elise wore long sleeves, every day, buttoned at the wrist. I noticed it the way you notice anything that's slightly wrong, not as a thought at first, just as a snag. A small wrongness that caught at the corner of my attention. A child in long sleeves buttoned tight in a heat wave. I noticed it and I filed it away and I told myself it was nothing. Some children are just like that. Some children run cold or don't like the sun on their arms or have a favorite cardigan they won't be parted from. 100 innocent explanations. It's probably nothing. But it's probably nothing is the most dangerous phrase there is. I'd learned that in the job about security. I hadn't yet learned how true it was about children. I'd learn it that summer. The snag didn't go away. It got worse, the way these things do once you've noticed them. Because once I'd seen the sleeves, I started seeing other things. Small things. Things that, one by one, meant nothing, but that together started to form a shape I didn't want to look at directly. I noticed that she flinched. Not dramatically, just a tiny, quick flinch, a flicker, when an adult moved too suddenly near her. The flinch of a child whose body has learned to expect that sudden movements sometimes mean pain. I noticed it and told myself it was nothing. I noticed that she went very quiet and very still around one particular adult in the household. Not afraid in any way you could point to, just smaller somehow in that person's presence, folding herself down, becoming less. I noticed it and told myself it was nothing. I noticed that she sometimes moved carefully, stiffly, the way you move when some part of you hurts and you don't want anyone to know. A 7-year-old should not move carefully. A 7-year-old should be all reckless motion. And this one sometimes moved like she was protecting something. I noticed it and told myself, but I couldn't tell myself it was nothing anymore. The pile of small nothings had grown too big. Together they'd become a something I could no longer look away from. I'm going to be careful here, the way I promised I would be, because this is the heart of the matter and it deserves care rather than drama. I came to understand, slowly, reluctantly, fighting the knowledge every step of the way because it was so terrible, that Princess Elise was being hurt. That someone in that household, someone who should have been keeping her safe, was instead the source of the flinch and the stillness and the careful movements and the long sleeves in summer. I won't describe what was being done to her, or by whom, in any detail, partly because the specifics don't belong in a story, and partly because the how matters far less than the that. A child was being harmed, quietly in a place full of people, by someone who relied on the simple fact that nobody looks closely at a quiet child, that everyone is busy, that it's probably nothing is always easier than the alternative. And the most chilling part, the part that has stayed with me for the rest of my life, is how invisible it was. How a child could be suffering every day in the middle of a busy palace full of staff and family and security, and almost no one saw. Not because they were bad people, because they weren't looking. Because the harm was hidden under long sleeves and quiet behavior and a child's terrible learned instinct to make herself small. Because the person doing it was careful and trusted and good at making everything look normal. Because seeing it would have meant believing something almost too awful to believe, and the human mind flinches from that, looks away, reaches for the innocent explanation. I almost looked away too. I want to be honest about that. There were days I told myself I was imagining it, that it was none of my business, that I was a guard and not a social worker, and that I should keep my eyes on my post and my nose out of the family's affairs. The pull to not see was enormous. It's always enormous. That's exactly why these things stay hidden. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't unsee the sleeves. I couldn't unsee the flinch. And one day I realized that if I stayed silent, if I let "it's probably nothing" win, then I would be just one more adult who walked past a hurting child every day and did nothing, and I would have to live with that for the rest of my life. So I decided to act. And the question of how to act, how a lowly guard, with no proof, only a pile of small wrong things and a terrible certainty, could protect a child without making everything worse, is the rest of the story. It was the hardest thing I ever did, and I nearly got it wrong in a way that could have cost everything. The first thing I had to fight was my own anger. Because when you finally let yourself see that a child is being hurt, the first thing that comes is a rage so total it frightens you. I wanted to find the person responsible and well. I won't say what I wanted to do, but it was the kind of thing that, however justified it felt, would have helped no one and harmed the very child I was trying to protect. A guard who loses control, who confronts and accuses and rages on nothing but his own certainty, doesn't save a child. He creates chaos. He tips off the person doing the harm. He gets himself removed and discredited, and leaves the child more alone and more endangered than before. So I made myself be still. The stillness I'd trained for years, the discipline of holding my post, of not reacting, of waiting, turned out to be the most important skill I had, and not for the reason I'd always thought. I'd learned to be still to guard a building. Now I had to be still to guard a child, which meant not letting my rage run ahead of my judgment. I had to think, carefully, because I would likely get only one chance to do this right, and if I did it wrong, the child would pay. Here was my problem, and it was a real one. I had no proof. I had a pile of small things, sleeves, a flinch, a stillness, a careful way of moving that added up to me to a terrible certainty, but that any one person could explain away. I hadn't seen anything happen. I couldn't point to a single moment and say that's the proof. If I went to the wrong person, or went about it the wrong way, I'd be a guard making a monstrous accusation against a trusted member of the household on the basis of nothing but his own suspicion. I'd be dismissed as paranoid, or worse, as malicious, and the person hurting Elise would be warned, and would become more careful, and the small wrong things would stop being visible, and the child would be driven deeper into the dark where no one could reach her. I had to be cleverer than my anger. I had to build something solid enough that it couldn't be waved away. I started carefully to pay closer attention, not in a way anyone could see. I was still just the guard at his post, still furniture, still invisible, but now I was watching with purpose. I was building in my own careful memory a record. The days she wore the sleeves, the moments she flinched, the particular adult around whom she went small and still, the times she moved carefully. I noted it all privately, patiently, the way you build a case rather than make an accusation. Not to play detective, I knew that wasn't my role, but so that when I finally spoke, I would have something more than a feeling. I would have a pattern, and a pattern is much, much harder to dismiss than a feeling. And I did one more thing, the most important thing, the thing I'm proudest of. I made myself even safer for her. I doubled down on being the steady, constant, predictable presence that a frightened child clings to. I made sure that every time she passed my post, there was a small warmth there for her, a quiet hello, a steady, kind look, the unspoken message that here, at least, was one adult who was always the same, always safe, who never moved suddenly, who never became something to fear. I wanted her to know, without my ever saying it, that I was someone she could trust. Because I had a feeling, a hope, that if I could become safe enough, she might one day find the courage to tell me something. And a child's own words, even a few of them, are worth more than all the patterns in the world. It took weeks, weeks of patience, of watching, of being steady, of holding my rage on its leash. The hardest weeks of my career, because every single day I knew the child was still being hurt and I was still, on the surface, doing nothing. The waiting was agony, but I understood that doing it fast and wrong would help no one, and doing it slow and right might save her. So I waited, and I watched, and I was steady. And then one afternoon, the child came to me. It was a quiet day. The heat wave had broken at last, and there was a soft gray coolness over everything, rain misting against the windows, the palace gone hushed and still the way it does on wet afternoons. I was at my post in one of the quieter corridors, and Princess Elise came down it, alone in her long sleeves, with that small, careful walk. And instead of passing me with her usual quiet hello, she stopped. She stood in front of me, this small 7-year-old, and she looked up at me for a long moment with those watchful eyes, the eyes of a child deciding whether the world could be trusted. And I held very still, and I gave her my steadiest, kindest look, and I waited. I didn't push. You never push. You just make yourself safe, and you wait, and you let them come to you in their own time, the way you do with any frightened creature. And in a small voice, barely above a whisper, she said, "Are you always here?" "I'm always here," I said, gently. "Every day, this is my post. I'm always right here." She thought about that, and then she said something that nearly broke me where I stood. She said, if I needed someone to be safe with, Could it be you? Could it be you? I crouched down slowly, carefully, no sudden movements, the way I'd trained myself for weeks to move around her so that I was at her level, looking up at her instead of down. And I said with everything I had, yes, it could be me. It can always be me. If you ever need someone to be safe with, you come to me and I will keep you safe. I promise you that. That is the most important promise I have ever made. And her eyes filled, and her chin went. And in a tiny, trembling voice, this 7-year-old child who had been making herself small and silent and unnoticeable for who knows how long began, haltingly, in the simple broken words of a child, to tell me. Not everything, not all at once, just a little, just enough. Just the edge of the truth she'd been carrying alone, finally spoken out loud to the one adult she'd decided was safe. I won't tell you her words. They're hers and they're not for a story, but they were enough. Enough to confirm everything. Enough to turn my certainty into knowledge. Enough that I knew, kneeling on that floor in the gray afternoon, that the waiting was over and the time to act had come. I did not act alone, and I want to be very clear about that, because it matters enormously, and because it's the thing people most often get wrong in stories like this. The hero does not save the child by confronting the villain himself. That's a fantasy, and a dangerous one. The real way you protect a child is by getting the right people, the people with the actual power and authority and training to act, involved, fast and correctly. But I also knew that I had to be careful who I went to, because the person hurting Elise was trusted within the household, and the wrong route would lead straight back to them. So I thought hard about who in that palace had both the power to act and the absolute integrity to act rightly, and I went to the one person I was certain of. A senior figure in the household far above me, someone I had served near for years and knew, to the bone, to be both powerful and genuinely good. Someone who loved those children. Someone who would not flinch from a terrible truth, and would not look away, and would have the authority to make sure the child was protected immediately and completely. And I want to honor that person, even though they're fictional, even though this whole kingdom is invented, because they stand for the real people in real places who do the right thing when a child's safety is on the line. I went to them privately and I told them everything. The sleeves, the flinch, the pattern I'd built over weeks, and finally, most importantly, what the child herself had begun to tell me. I laid it all out, carefully, completely, and I watched this powerful, good person's face change as they understood what they were hearing. And then I watched them do exactly what a good person with power does. They did not hesitate. They did not minimize. They did not reach for the comforting "it's probably nothing." They acted fast and decisively and with the full weight of their authority to protect that child. What happened next, how the child was kept safe, and how the truth came fully to light, and the confrontation that followed, is the last part of the story. And it's the part where I learned what it really means to protect someone, and where a quiet little girl in long sleeves finally got to be a child again. Once the senior figure I'd gone to understood the truth, everything moved quickly and quietly and rightly. The first thing, the only thing that mattered in those first hours, was the child's safety, and she was made safe, immediately. Removed from any further reach of the person who had been hurting her, placed in the care of people who would protect her absolutely, surrounded, for the first time in who knows how long, by adults who saw her, all of her, and would let no harm near her again. I won't detail the mechanics of it. I'll just tell you that within a very short time of my speaking up, the small girl in the long sleeves was somewhere she could not be hurt, with people whose whole purpose was now to keep her that way. That's the thing I want you to take from this above all else. The moment one adult finally saw and spoke and went to the right person, the whole machinery of protection that should surround a child snapped into place around her. It had been there all along. The good people, the power, the will to protect her, all of it existed. It just hadn't been activated because the harm had stayed invisible. The instant it became visible to the right eyes, the child was safe. All it had needed was for one person to refuse to look away. There was a confrontation. There had to be. The person responsible had to be faced with what they'd done and removed, and prevented from ever being near that child or any child again. I wasn't in the room for it, that was far above my place, but I know it happened, and I know it was handled by the senior figure with a cold, controlled, righteous fury that left no room for excuses or evasions. The truth was laid out. The pattern. The child's own words, gently and carefully obtained by people trained to do it right. And there was no arguing with it. The person who had hidden their cruelty behind trust and busyness, and a child's enforced silence was exposed completely, and dealt with, removed from the household entirely, kept far away from Elise forever, and made to face the proper consequences of what they had done. I'll be honest, part of me had wanted to be the one to confront them, that old rage. I'd imagined it in the dark weeks of watching and waiting, me finally facing the person who'd hurt her, saying everything I'd been holding in. But I understood by the end that it was right that I wasn't the one. My job had never been the confrontation. My job had been to see and to believe and to speak to the right person. The confrontation belonged to those with the authority for it. The hero of a child protection story isn't the avenger, it's the witness, the one who notices, the one who refuses to accept it's probably nothing. That was my part, and it turned out to be the part that mattered most, because without the noticing, there's no confrontation at all, just a child who keeps suffering in silence while everyone walks past. I want to tell you about Elise after, because that's the part that healed something in me. It didn't happen overnight. A child who's been through what she'd been through doesn't simply bounce back the moment the danger's removed. There was a long road for her, proper care, proper help, the patient work of trained, gentle people rebuilding a child's sense that the world can be safe. Healing like that takes time, and it isn't simple, and I won't pretend it was. But she had, at last, everything she needed for it. Safety and people who saw her, and the time and care to mend. And over the months I got to watch it happen, from my post, the way I'd watched everything. I watched the little girl in the long sleeves slowly become a different child. The flinch went away bit by bit. The careful, stiff way of moving eased into the loose recklessness a 7-year-old's body is supposed to have. The watchfulness in her eyes, that survival watchfulness that learned wariness, softened over time into something lighter. She started to take up space again. To be loud sometimes. To run. To laugh in the corridors in a way I'd never heard her laugh before. A real, unguarded, ringing child's laugh that was the most beautiful sound I ever heard in that palace. And this is the thing, she wore short sleeves again. When the next summer came, the warm weather returned, and the little princess of Aldenmore ran about the palace grounds in short sleeves, her arms bare in the sun, like any child, like every child, with nothing to hide and no need to hide it. I saw her one day, from a window, tearing across a lawn in the sunshine with her arms thrown wide, and I had to step back from the glass because I couldn't see it properly through the wet in my own eyes. Short sleeves in summer, the smallest thing, and the biggest victory I was ever part of. She never forgot. That's the part that undoes me, even now. Children remember who was safe. As she grew, and I stayed at that post for years more and watched her grow, she never lost the bond we'd formed in that gray corridor, the day she'd asked me, could it be you? She'd grown into a bright, strong, healthy girl, miles away from the small, silent creature in the long sleeves, and you'd never have known to see her, what she'd survived. But she remembered. Every time she passed my post, even years later, even when she was far too old and far too grand for it, she'd catch my eye and give me a particular small nod. Our nod. The one that meant you were the one who was safe. You were the one who saw me. I haven't forgotten, and I'd give it back. I haven't forgotten either, and I'd do it all again. I never needed any medal. I never got one, and I never wanted one. That nod was the only honor I ever needed. A child I'd helped pull out of the dark, grown safe and whole and strong, telling me without a word, year after year, that it had mattered. That I had mattered. There is no decoration in the world worth more than that. I've told this story, finally, as fiction, invented kingdom, invented names, every detail changed, because the child in it deserves her privacy and always will. But I've told it because the truth underneath it is not fiction at all, and because I think people need to hear it. Here is the truth. Children who are being hurt almost never say so. They make themselves small and quiet and unnoticeable. They wear long sleeves in summer. They flinch and go still and move carefully and hope someone notices, because they cannot find the words to say it out loud, or they've been made too afraid to. And the adults around them, even good adults, even loving adults, walk past every day and tell themselves it's probably nothing, because seeing it would mean believing something too terrible to believe, and the mind flinches from that the way the child flinches from a raised hand. The whole thing, a child's whole rescue, turns on one person refusing to do that. One person who notices the snag and doesn't smooth it over. One person who lets the pile of small wrong things add up to a something instead of explaining each one away. One person who makes themselves safe and waits and believes the child when the child finally whispers and takes it to someone who can act. That's all it takes. One person paying close enough attention. One person who won't look away. I was furniture in a palace, invisible, forgotten, the least important person in every room I stood in, and it turned out that being invisible was exactly what let me see the child everyone else was too busy and too important to really look at. The guard nobody noticed was the one who noticed the child nobody noticed, and a little girl got her short sleeves back because of it. We think we need to be powerful to protect someone. We don't. We need to be paying attention. That's the whole secret. The most powerful people in that palace walked past Elise's suffering for who knows how long, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't looking. And a forgotten guard at a post saw it, because looking was the only thing he had to offer, and it turned out to be enough. It turned out to be everything. Notice the quiet child. Notice the long sleeves in summer. Notice the snag that doesn't fit, and don't smooth it over and don't look away. You don't need to be powerful. You just need to see and to believe and to speak. It might be the most important thing you ever do. It was for me, a little girl in long sleeves who got to wear short sleeves again. I'd trade every other thing I ever did for that one, and I'd do it 1,000 times over. She got to be a child again. That's the whole story. That's everything.